Hello everyone and welcome to the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm your host to this podcast, which offers a platform for lawyers to share their story and their journey into law and activism. Our guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer up advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law or criminal justice. The Activist Lawyer podcast is brought to you by the Granite Podcast Studio. Thank you so much for listening. Today I am joined by Tayab Ali, who is the director at the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. Tayab is an internationally recognised and highly respected solicitor advocate. His practice encompasses criminal and civil and public law in both the UK and international jurisdictions. He is a partner and head of international law at leading and award-winning London law firm Bindmans LLP. As a lawyer, Tayab's work and case profiles have consistently been recognised by the principal legal directories, which have ranked him as a leading lawyer in multiple practice areas. Chambers and partners described him as an irresistible force. He's fearless and he always gets the right result for his clients. He is rated as a super lawyer by Thomson Reuters and recognised in the field of civil liberties by the Legal 500. And yes, I think once you listen to this podcast, and if you're already familiar with Tayab, you will certainly agree with those descriptions of him. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with Tayab, not only because of his direct legal action and work on Palestine, which is making and will make a significant difference in terms of the pursuit of justice, and I'm talking globally, and holding players accountable for either their complicity or direct involvement in breaches of international law. But also, Tayab shares his thought process in summing up whether he wanted to become a politician, which was his first inkling. That was a way that he saw that he could make change, or pursue a career as a lawyer. So I think listeners will find this incredibly interesting, and there's a call to action at the end. So please stay tuned and enjoy today's episode. Welcome Tayab Ali to the podcast. Tayab, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Really great to be here.
So perhaps we can go back in time a little bit and discuss why you wanted to become a lawyer in the first place and maybe who or what inspired you.
I mean, that's a good question, and it's often something I reflect on in order to keep myself doing the things that I do and doing them in the way that I do them. And originally, when I was in college studying A-levels, I was studying sciences. And I wanted to be a pilot. That was my plan. And then having a lot of fun in college, I was part of the charities committee. And I remember dressing up in a gorilla suit, running around my local town, raising money for children victims of war crimes abroad. And it wasn't that project wasn't really because we were raising money for victims of war crimes or children in particular. Genuinely, it was because it was something fun to do. And that was just where the money was going to go. And the people that were involved in our committee weren't particularly politically aware or anything like that. And during that process, something happened, which was, took me by surprise. And what happened was we raised, I think partly because I was probably harassing people in the town centre in a gorilla suit, we raised quite a lot of money. We raised a few £1,000s, which was quite an achievement for young kids at that time. And parents of some of the students started to complain when they learned that the money was going to go to foreign victims of war crimes. And I remember being called into the head's office and being told this, and him giving me this choice as to what we were going to do with it. And it started my political awareness. And I was really surprised that people would object, not because of what we were doing, but where we were sending the money. And I didn't really understand that. I couldn't grasp why they cared. And that started me on a personal education about why people would think like that. And so in trying to understand that, why they would do something like that, it led me to study conflicts and why human beings end up being in conflict with each other on a level where we kill each other. And I started, interestingly, in World War II, and I learned, I knew, but I learned, which is a different thing. I actually studied it as opposed to just having the knowledge that World War II happened, there were some Nazis who were bad people, they killed people, we beat them, everything's happy. But I actually looked into it, and I looked into a different way. And suddenly, the fact that the Nazis had killed 6 million Jews meant something different. And the fact that a total of 11 million people died in World War II at the hands of the Nazis in concentration camps meant something different. But the number that really astounded me was that as human beings, we killed 75 million people in that conflict on all sides, whether they were Nazis, whether they were the British, whether they're allies. 75 million people. And I had to recheck that number over and over again because I didn't think it could be right. Yeah. That in that short period of time, we just decided to pick up guns. I mean, and I say it quite flippantly, but for me, what resonates is not that anybody's excuse or reason or rationale in doing what they decided to do, whether it's Hitler or the Allies or anything like that. It was just a number of people that we killed. Yeah. And I say we because we have a collective responsibility for that. And I decided at that point, I mean, that really had an impact on me. It really had an impact on me. And I could see, I'm not calling the people that were objecting to the charitable work that we were doing, but I saw some of the beginning of that in their objections. It was similar. They were choosing on what was right or wrong, not because of what was happening to people, because of who they were and where they were from. And, we have that's unfortunately resonating to this day. But I decided, interestingly, that I no longer wanted to be a pilot. And I decided that I wanted to actually be a politician. That was my plan. So I said, right, okay, how do I get involved in this? How do I stop this from happening? And I thought, well, let me be a decision maker. Let me be a politician. And then I thought, well, where's the best training ground for a politician? And I thought, well, being a lawyer is pretty good. It teaches you how to speak, hopefully. I'm relatively clear. Teaches you how to think, teaches you how to be critical, teaches you how to act. And I thought, okay, let's do that. Let's actually change my A-levels. I dropped physics and I restarted my A-levels, and I did chemistry, biology, because I was good at those. I was all right at those. And I took English language. And I kind of did that to block going down sort of the scientific route and make sure that I would then be able to do law. Yeah. And on my journey, I was really, really inspired by stories of other lawyers, people like Nelson Mandela, who were at great personal cost to themselves, advocated for what they thought was right, and they risked everything that they could have done or had done or achieved to do what was right and to root their sort of work in principle. And that was a really, really important, those lessons were really important for me. And, so I started reading about people like Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, just anybody I could get my hands on that was a lawyer or a human rights advocate. We had a really strong human rights group of lawyers in the UK, people like Gareth Peirce, people like Jeffrey Bindman, the firm that I'm in at the moment. These people really inspired me. And then on this journey, in sort of, and I really was definitely planning on trying to run for Parliament. That was an absolute target for me. But on the journey, I had a second realization, which is that politicians are not what I thought they would be, in that they're restricted in what they can do. And I haven't met a politician. I mean, I've spoken to many politicians, but I'll say this, not all politicians, but most politicians have to compromise what they really think for the sake of the vote, for the sake of the party whip, or for some political advantage. And I find that really difficult to deal with. And I find it really difficult to deal with a politician that will vote in one way and in private tell me how hard that was for them to do and how, they're trying to get somewhere to do something and then they'll do the right thing. And you see this characteristic in politicians a lot. Once they finish their political period, they suddenly find some consciousness and start to do human rights work and start to speak about what's right and wrong in a way that they decided that they would not do. And I say decided because they do make a decision. They decided not to do while they're in office. And for me, that meant that the political establishment was not something I could join or wanted to join anymore. And in my discussions with various political parties and politicians about whether I would make a good politician or not, I very quickly come to the conclusion, as of they, that I wouldn't fit. I wouldn't fit in the political establishment. When I've tried to discuss things with them, I can't not say what I think, and I can't not say what is right or what I think is right. for some sort of political or even career advantage, just refused to do it. And so now as a lawyer, in the position that I'm in, I found something quite amazing, that I actually have probably more influence and more access and more ability to hold people to account as a lawyer than I ever would as a politician. And where I am now in terms of my work at Bindmans and ICJP, I have this unique situation where I have phenomenal access to politicians across our political establishment in the UK, but not just that, across the globe as well. And it's important to me to, in this relationship, not just to be able to talk to them, but in these relationships, hold those politicians to account. And it has happened where I have spoken to politicians in other countries, senior politicians, and then because of some legal work I've done, they've actually phoned me and said, I thought you were our friend. What about this legal work? And I said, doing this legal work against you is being your friend. Because I'm litigating what's right and wrong, and I'm not prepared to, because of our relationship, agree with you just because we have a relationship. And I find that is much more important. And what I found as well is most of these politicians don't break off the relationship if you're as honest as that with them.
Gosh, and people will be at that crossroads where they're contemplating a life in politics or law. So that's a really great insight into how, you know, your experience, but the fact that by the fact that you're a lawyer, you are able to hold politicians to account. And I know that you are very vocal, Tayab, because I follow you on social media. And I mean, that's where I came into contact with your work and the work that you do outside of Bindmans. But just focusing a little bit on Bindmans, you are partner in the crime, fraud and regulatory team. I take it that's more of the international aspect of things. But what does your kind of day-to-day job look like? What's on your desk?
I mean, listen, I'm very lucky in that I don't really go to work. If I became a billionaire overnight, which would be nice, but unlikely, I would do what I do every day. So I get up and I do what I would do regardless of the income that I have. And so I've created a practice in Bindmans, which is really important to me. And it's something that I feel is important in terms of my position in sort of the advocacy work I do as well. But in Bindmans, I do regular crime, and I do defense. I represent people accused of criminal offences, all the way across from sometimes theft, sometimes serious sexual offences, sometimes murder, sometimes terrorism, sometimes national security. And I do work across that whole spectrum. And the reason that I chose criminal law and why criminal law is really important to me, I mean, I am effectively a criminal defense lawyer in my heart and inside my core, and that's my training, is because when I was looking at sort of what kind of lawyer I wanted to be most effective in having social change, and of course there's public law, which is also very important. But I looked at criminal law as a way that human beings regulate their behavior towards each other. And so, for example, you at the most basic level, criminal law tells you can't kill people, you can't steal, you can't harm people. And if you do, there's consequences to that. And then when I saw how that was used by governments to sometimes marginalize and criminalize movements and communities and push power from the people to the state so they could have elements of control over the people, I realized that the right to a fair trial, the right to legal representation became even more important to push back against the state's power, even in the context of criminal law. And that comes from whatever kind of case you're doing. And so my work focuses around that, making sure that I represent everybody that needs representation, asks me to represent them. I don't choose my cases in terms of what the allegations are against them. I do feel quite proud of the fact that I do represent people that other people might not like to represent. And I say I feel proud of that because it's easy to represent somebody that you know is innocent, if you like. somebody that you know is, if or even somebody where you feel sorry for the individual, where they may have acted as a response to something that happened to them, taken violent action because a member of their family had been hurt by somebody. I mean, it's easy to represent people in that category. It's not easy to represent a terrorist that actually wanted to do harm to people. It's not easy to represent a rapist that actually wanted to rape somebody and did rape somebody. It's not easy to represent somebody who gratuitously steals from people, other vulnerable people. It's not easy, but it's really important to represent those people. And it's important to represent those people because in representing those people, it has an impact on our system. It has an impact on the police. It makes sure they do their job properly. It has an impact on the prosecution. It makes sure that they can only prosecute people with evidence. It makes sure that the people that are convicted are the people that should be convicted. And it's more likely when you work in the system and you work in that way, that the people that are innocent are going to be found innocent because the system around them works. And so it's really important that everybody has this right to proper representation. And so within Bindmans, I kind of specialize in national security, counterterrorism, human rights violations, politically sensitive cases, that kind of case. But if somebody asks me to represent them because of some injustice that's happened to them, and it's a regular criminal offence, and I have the capacity to do it, because obviously that is important, I have the time to represent people, I'll do that kind of work too.
Brilliant. And I'm sure you bring a lot of the your criminal defence training into your role as director of the ICJP, which is the International Centre for Justice for Palestinians. Can you tell us a little bit about the organisation, Tayab, and how you got involved in it, your role, and maybe what the core objectives of the ICJP are for people who aren't familiar?
The ICJP is an organisation that I set up, and I set it up for a very particular reason. In 2009, a group of Palestinian individuals in the UK came to me and said, "You're doing all this work in the war on terror in relation to allegations of British complicity in torture in places like Pakistan. You've litigated that in court for your clients. You've talked about that in the news and newspapers. But why are you ignoring Palestine?" And I was like, well, I'm not ignoring Palestine, but I kind of thought you guys would have so many lawyers doing work for you. This has been going on since such a long time. I didn't think I was welcome into that arena. And I thought, maybe I was busy doing other stuff. And they said to me, look, we have lawyers working on this, but we don't have very much success. Why don't you have a look at something and see what you could do to help? And so I picked a project, and I picked, interestingly, a war crimes prosecution. And I studied that and what the United Kingdom had done, what other states had done with regards to allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by Israeli actors. And Operation Cast Lead happened during this investigation period of mine. And if you know what Operation Cast Lead is, in 2008-9, Israeli forces attacked Gaza. There wasn't one of those situations where there was an attack on Israelis, as people say happened in the current situation. And anyway, I studied how people had applied for arrest warrants, and within the legal team that I was in, I made a decision to apply my knowledge of criminal law and criminal defense law and criminal prosecution processes to the application of an arrest warrant. And the significant change that I made in my work for the Zipper Livni arrest warrant is that I identified that what people were tending to do was to go to apply for arrest warrants with what I'd call information. There's ample information about what Israel's doing, NGO reports, people's opinions, documents from the United Nations, UN special resolutions. So people would go into court with like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 pages of evidence or information, give it to a judge and say, look, this tells you a story. Can I have an arrest warrant, please? And the judge can't act on that. As much as the judge might want to act on that, can't act on that because it's not evidence. And so in the Zipper Livni arrest warrant case, without going into the detail of what happened in the case, we put together an actual small bundle of material, relatively small. We got first-hand eyewitness statements from victims, people that saw the attacks that happened in this particular strike that we were litigating, or we wanted to get an arrest warrant for. And we got expert evidence. We had photographs from the scene of the crime. And we had specialist experts that told us about command control responsibility from the war cabinet all the way down to the soldiers on the ground. And it was relatively small. It was probably about 400 or 500 pages, not a lot of material. And you'll understand in a criminal case, that's not a lot of material. But it was hard hitting. It was credible. It was very, very on point. And we applied for, we discussed this with the police in the UK. We discussed it with the Crown Prosecution Service. We made our application and we were successful. We got an arrest warrant. Phenomenal result. It was a phenomenal result. It resonated. It effectively broke relationships between the political establishment in the UK and Israel for 2 years, because no longer could the British government give impunity and guarantee impunity to Israeli suspected war criminals. And they had to say, well, this is the law in our country. It depends what the court and the judge decides. And here was an example, suddenly, of the court doing something that the government didn't have control over. So what the government did really despicably, and I say this really despicably, and one of the reasons why I can't join that political establishment, I can't do it, they changed the law to protect war criminals. That's what they did. 2 years later, they meant that anytime somebody like me applied for an arrest warrant, the Attorney General, a politician, had to give consent to it. And of course, this interferes with the separation of powers. It interferes with the rule of law. It interferes with justice. And we changed the law to do it. It was a parliamentary process. I find that disgraceful. And what, in essence, what that is, it's the government, it's the parliament saying, yes, we want to sometimes protect war criminals. That's what it says. That's what it means.
It is.
And I don't like that. And so we went into a period of time of, again, this sort of self-reflection and study I do. And Palestinians were providing funding for some of the work that we were doing. And somebody said to me, one of the donors said to me, but Tayab, we can't do anything anymore. And I said, yeah, you're right. You're right, we can't do anything. And this is giving you funding to apply for arrest warrants, a waste of money. And I said, yeah, honestly, it is. And perhaps you should find something better to do with that money, like give it to victims of war crimes, for example, and let me just work out what I want to do with this problem. And I literally stopped actively working on Palestine-related issues for a couple of years. And then I went to a few meetings with the people, various groups in the Palestinian diaspora, to talk about creating coalitions and groups. And I found that people were reinventing the wheel in the same way over and over again. Let's get together, let's make a group, let's talk about it, let's issue reports. And I didn't want to do that. And then literally in my bedroom, I learned how to create a website. And I made the ICJP website on my computer. I'm not very good at website building, by the way. Somehow, flukily, I think my Mac probably helped me to create it somehow. And I created the idea. And when what happens when you create a visualization of an idea, people can buy into it. People can see it. Rather than just me saying to you, hey, I want a legal center that's going to prosecute war criminals. You create what it would look like, and people can log on to the website and say, oh, wow, this is really great. And I said, well, it doesn't exist. It's just an idea at the moment. Do you want to support it? And then what happened with that idea is I got politicians to support it. I got academics to support it. I got lawyers to support it. Jeffrey Bindman, one of my heroes in terms of civil liberties, human rights, became a patron for it, came on our advisory board. Was really honored that he agreed to do that, gave us support. And ICJP was born. And the idea in ICJP was not to just prepare reports. It was to do a number of things. Number one, it was to act as a fireguard for NGOs that were frightened to do the kind of work we wanted to do. I decided that my career as a lawyer wasn't that important as doing the right thing. So I would step out first. And what that meant was that where people were frightened to do this kind of work, and they were frightened, they are frightened, and we can talk about that if you want to, why they're frightened to do this kind of work. I would talk about apartheid. I would talk about BDS. I would talk about illegal occupation. I would talk about the right to resist occupation using violence, lawful violence. Not necessarily everything that happened on October the 7th, just to be clear before people jump on that, but lawful violence, which is a Geneva Convention right in international law. And we decided to be that person. We decided to be not apolitical. We decided to not allow any Palestinian group that was politically aligned to any other group to be part of us. So no Hamas, no Fatah, no Palestinian Authority. We weren't going to platform them. We might even criticize them. because there may be a place to criticize Palestinian leadership groups. We haven't at the moment because there's so much work to do in terms of protecting and saving life. So that's where we're focusing. So two of the first things that we did in our first year is three things that we did that kind of demonstrate that aspect of our work. We held a conference in Westminster on apartheid. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israeli human rights organizations came and showcased that. 200 or 300 people came to this, including politicians, and we spoke about Israel's involvement in acts of apartheid in regards to the Palestinian people. And it normalized being able to talk about apartheid in that context. People suddenly were like, well, look, they did it. Nobody's really attacking them, or the attacks that are happening on them, they don't care about, so we can now talk about that. 6 months later, we did another conference, again, 200 or 300 people, again held in Westminster, in Westminster, and this is the Westminster estate, not in Parliament, just to be clear about it. We held one on BDS. We spoke about BDS. We explained what BDS was, that it's not a racist endeavor, why it's important, and that attracted a lot of interest. And then we did another thing at BAFTA. We showcased a film, Tantura, and we used the BAFTA cinema in order to showcase a film called Tantura, which was made by Israeli filmmakers, which was interviewing Israeli soldiers who were active in 1948 Nakba, who were explaining, confessing to really serious criminal acts against the Palestinian people. And there was a lot of pushback from Palestinian groups as well. Why are you showcasing an Israeli film? Why are you not advocating the Palestinian voice? And for me, it was really important that where truth was spoken by whoever it was spoken by, it should be amplified, whether they're Israelis, and ironically, that film was funded partly by the Israeli government.
Right.
Okay. And it was bad. The reason we wanted to showcase it is because cinemas weren't showing it. It was a really important film, and people were not showing it. And so we showed that film. And then we had a debate afterwards with prominent academics about the film. It was really important. So that's one aspect of work that we've been doing. We've been lobbying, speaking to, discussing Palestinian rights issues with politicians across the world. So far, ICJP have engaged with over 47 countries since October the 7th. Head of state, Minister of Justice, Foreign Office, and ambassador level. And that's a lot of briefing of a lot of states. And it's interesting how little they actually know until you sit with them and explain the situation. And it's amazing how much that changes people's perspectives. And then, of course, the final part of the work that we do is direct legal action, which is really important. I don't want people to die on a battlefield. I would much rather they get upset with each other in a courtroom. Much more civilized, much more in keeping with my personal core principles and the principles of ICJP. I'd rather have a fight with you any day in a courtroom, even if it's a vicious, horrible fight with you any day in a courtroom, than take it on the streets or into a battlefield with guns and weapons and tanks and missiles. And abide by whatever the ruling of that court is, even if it's one that I don't like, even if it's one that's against me. I'm happy to have my battle in the courtroom. And so we started to do ICC work. We started to support other people doing their work. And we are involved, as you know, in direct legal action, which we can talk about if you want.
Yeah, we will. Just as well, I mean, you mentioned apartheid, you mentioned the Nakba, obviously none of this is new. None of what we're experiencing is new. Although I'm wondering how what's happening in Gaza and the broader occupied territories right now, so the ongoing crisis, exacerbated by, of course, Israel's actions, and nothing seems to improve. How is this currently influencing your work? I mean, your team, your strategies, is there a lot more pressure on you are you focusing on one particular area?
Well, look, the current situation has intensified every aspect of ICJP's work. And what it's done, and I've talked a lot about like my ideas, my plan, and what I wanted to do. But in all honesty and seriousness, ICJP's team is phenomenal. Every single member of staff at ICJP is a personal hero of mine. I'll tell you, the way they think, the way their passion, their skill, it's phenomenal. And that's the real strength of ICJP. They keep the organization on track. They make sure that we are effective. And they are some of the bravest people, I mean, genuinely, some of the bravest people I have met. And why I say that is that they go after being known for doing the work they do, they've been into Israel in the last 18 months. They've been into refugee camps to gather evidence. And they know the personal risk this puts them under. We have discussions about it, but they do it. And they do it because they share the principles of ICJP and the principles I've tried to elucidate in this conversation. But what we did, what was really the saddest thing is that on October the 9th, ICJP, the people in ICJP, we understood and knew exactly what was going to happen as a result of October the 7th. And I say as a result of. But the reason we knew was because we knew what Israel was capable of doing in 2014, in 2008 and 9, and every few years, in fact, in conflicts or attacks on Palestinians, even when Palestinians haven't done anything in respect of Israel. So you get October the 7th happen, and you get a significant number of hostages taken, and you get a significant number of Israelis killed. You know that Israel is going to react. And on October the 9th, I did a speech at the Labour Party conference. And I was asked by people, look, don't do this speech because it's a bit sensitive right now. And I said, no, this is really important to do it because we have to explain the danger of what's coming and what Israel is about to do. And that's what my speech was about. It was about the importance of holding Israel back in terms of explaining that Israel has been shielded by impunity for such a long time. They're going to kill thousands of people in Palestine as a result of October. I actually think in my speech, I estimated around 100,000 people. And if you think about that number, in light of the previous couple of thousand that had been killed in conflict, we just assessed it would be that much. We were on the money, to be frank. We were on the money. And what really disturbed us was that already Israel was talking about acts of self-defense. Already our politicians were talking about the right to self-defense and standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel, almost like they were too stupid to even understand what Israel was capable of doing, what Israel had done in the past, the war crimes Israel had already participated in. And so on October the 9th, we did this speech. I was on Newsnight that evening discussing with prominent pro-Israel defenders who agreed with me, in fact, that they could see, it was Margaret Hodge, who could see that the Netanyahu right-wing government would lead to violence. She agreed that she had said that previously in a newspaper article and agreed that the political establishment could have done more to prevent October the 7th as well. And then I wouldn't say she agreed with me as to what was coming, but I tried to elucidate I tried to explain what we thought was going to happen, but we didn't manage to get that far for the usual reasons of being cut off at important parts of BBC interviews, but that happened. And then immediately after that, we set up something called the Justice for Gaza campaign. It's a really important aspect of ICJP's work. The Justice for Gaza campaign was because we knew what was coming, was to collect evidence of war crimes that we thought would be perpetrated by Israel, hoping they wouldn't be, of course, but being prepared for if they were, with regards to collecting that evidence on a standard that would be usable in a British criminal court by British police, if necessary, in a prosecution for war crimes. And that's the mechanism that we use at ICJP. So we collect our evidence in a very particular way. All the evidence that we collect from victims and witnesses is video recorded using attaining best evidence protocols that the police use. We use British police operational protocol to secure that evidence, to secure it in evidence bags, to make sure that it would be admissible. Since we started that project and we were vocal about that project, some officers from the Metropolitan Police contacted us and asked if they could join our team, which was really interesting. We interviewed a couple. One Metropolitan Police officer left the Met as a detective and has joined us as a full-time investigator, which is phenomenal in terms of the support that's given us. And so we have people like that working in the investigation team. And now we have a body of evidence, which is probably world leading, used by the ICC, used by the ICJ South African team, used in British courts, and will be continued be used across litigation across the world as part of the ICJP project, Global 195, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
And that includes 140 witness statements. 40 plus of those witness statements are of professional people that were in Gaza, at the professional medical experts, if you like, that were in Gaza for periods of time since October the 7th to the present time. But 80 of them are victims that are receiving medical treatment, men, women, and children, that were in Gaza during the last, since October the 7th, and have provided first-hand eyewitness testimony with regards to what they suffered, how they got injured, and what they saw. And from that massive body of really strong evidence, we're building a minute-by-minute timeline of what happened and what our evidence shows has happened since October the 7th. The ambition is to get that timeline with the evidential references to document every hour of every day since October the 7th to present time and going forward, because that's the engine to the prosecutions that we're looking at. And of course, there's another reason, because if Israel continues with this impunity, which, I mean, like Netanyahu apparently in Hungary right now, he
was
should
in
be being
Greece
arrested
this week as well.
And so in that context, we want the historical record to show the truth, regardless of what happens in our courts, regardless of, I mean, Keir Starmer wants his legacy to be a certain way. Our Attorney General wants his legacy to be a certain way. Politicians want their legacy to be a certain way, but the records will show the truth. Yeah. And their legacy will not be what they think it will be when the truth is spoken in these records. And that's another reason for keeping it. But the final point I'll say about that is that these records, I will make a promise on this podcast, as I've made a promise in the past in my speeches. I will make sure that this evidential record will haunt politicians after they finish their tenure in whatever they do next, whether that's in private financial business, whether that's advisory roles, whether that's so-called, I'm now a human rights activist. This record will not be forgotten in respect of what they've done whilst they're in office. That we're not going to let them off the hook this time.
Yeah. Excellent. My goodness. Well, look, I mean, ICJP at the fore of attempts to hold Israel accountable. But I'm just wondering, going back to your earlier comment on why people are afraid of this work. Why are people afraid to get involved in this work, even if they have the will and desire to do so? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, for me, it's just straightforward. You have, Israel is a rich, powerful state. It's funded by the most rich and powerful state on the planet. Sometimes you have to wonder whether Israel is a project of America or if America is a project of Israel. It's sometimes hard to sort of figure that out. But the point of this is that Israel is not stupid. It's clever. It's created an infrastructure across the globe of influence and lobbying and financial support. And so if you raise your head in terms of Palestinian rights, you can expect a lobbyist, an individual, a apparent regular person to take issue with that advocacy. And so if you're a doctor, suddenly you're reported to the GMC. If you're a solicitor or a barrister, you're reported to your regulator. If you're a charity, you're reported to your regulator. And by the way, that kind of reporting is really pernicious. I have, I can't say because they're current client, but I have a charity that is kind of completely irrelevant in the political establishment. Let's just say they're an exercise group, right? And that charity was reported to the Charity Commission because they might have done work giving Zoom-related support to people in the occupied territories. And the Charity Commission issued an investigation. So, you know, you have that level of reporting, and people are worried about it. I mean, you understand people work because they earn money to feed their families and pay their bills. And if it's very easy to destabilize somebody when you do some Palestinian advocacy, and then suddenly somebody says, well, actually, this is anti-Semitic, or this is inappropriate, or you're making factual assertions which are not true, and then they hold you to account for it. And just that investigation makes people worried. Yeah. And so, you know, I had a conversation with my family, with my children, and I said to them, I said, look, you know, there's something really serious is happening in Gaza. They're not very politically sort of engaged, my children, which is fine. But I'm potentially going to risk our comfort because I can't not say the things I need to say and do the things I need to do, but that might cause us some issues. And it might mean that I have to stop being a solicitor if I make a mistake or somebody makes an allegation which I can't defend. And we might have to do something different, and that will affect your comfort. And they said, well, if that's what you want to do, Dad, you do it. And that's the decision we made. I'm prepared to lose my status as a solicitor and a partner in a law firm in order to do what's right. Because you know what? My contingency, I say this as a bit of a joke, but it's also true now. And my contingency plan is to go into the food business. I will create a burger bar called Freedom Burgers and sell burgers and build my advocacy, right? And do that in a particular way. But if you don't have to be a lawyer to do this advocacy, you don't have to be a lawyer to stand up for what's right and wrong. And you have to make this decision. And you know what I found? Let them make the allegations. I've had complaints made about me. I've met with the people that made the complaints. I sat down and explained what I'm doing, and I'm saying, you're not going to stop me. I just push them back. And so that's the reason why people are frightened. And our press, the last point, our press is pathetic right now. It's really pathetic. It's not making a stand. I represent journalists in the work I do at Bindmans, and I protect journalistic freedom. I sometimes wonder if the mainstream press is now worthy of that same protection as it has been in the past, because it is not doing its job. It's not holding truth to power. It's not talking about and providing proper debate and proper information about what's happening on the ground in Gaza or what Israel is doing. And it does engage with the Israeli lobbying war machine and does succumb to a lot of what Israel wants to do. And that's why I'm really grateful for you doing this podcast and giving me an opportunity to speak about my work, because you would think that, and ICJP's work, you would think that the step that we've taken, which is actually, I recognize it as being a historic step, would be something that the mainstream media wanted to talk about or wanted to know about. Let me tell you, at our press conference, not one single mainstream media outlet came to the press conference, not one. And that tells you about where they are.
Yeah, it tells you everything. I mean, they're not even covering the distressing images that we woke up to this morning of, it just won't feature. And are they complicit? I mean, people are going so far as to say that, they're collaborating as such. And, we'll move on to the government in a little bit, but would you go as far to say that in how things have been reported, is this complicity?
I'd say that if you are supporting war crimes by giving it cover, support, legitimacy, and you know that you're doing that, then that's a criminal act.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, we'll get on to the project, your newly launched initiative shortly, but I just wanted to focus on one thing, and we have covered this on the podcast before, but I'm interested in hearing your perspective, and we're honing in again on the UK government. But just in terms of the continued sale of arms to Israel, I know that there has been legal action taken by Glan and by Al-Haq in terms of this ongoing military support. But given that the ICJ's made reference to plausible genocide against Palestinians and the obligations that states have and parties to the Genocide Convention have, what responsibilities, how does the UK look on the world stage, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I mean, just last week you had David Lammy suggesting that Israel has breached international law, and it was almost immediately retracted by Number 10 to say that, no, there was, a risk of breaching international law. What is the UK doing, and how are they viewed? I mean, this is some serious stuff here,
Yeah, I said to you I'd name names, and I will. I find David Lammy's position generally weak and pathetic and subservient to the United States. And you saw at the recent security conference him doing debates with the United States, and sort of, it was very clear that he wanted to be under the wing of the United States. I'm not sure the United States wants us to be under their wing, but that's where they're taking their political stance from. But really, Keir Starmer, I instructed Keir Starmer in the past, and I know the kind of lawyer he is. The kind of lawyer that he was is not the kind of prime minister that he is. And I say that he should know. He should know what the situation is. He's advocated about Palestinian rights in the past. He's advocated I mean, I'm not talking about in court. I'm talking about on a platform, right? In court, he's advocated as a barrister on genocide. So he knows. He knows the situation. He's called out. So Keir's called out war crimes in relation to Russia, in relation to Ukraine. So he's able to do that. And so what does it tell me about Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, the man that is not able to do the same thing with regards to Israel? Well, it tells me that he's probably complicit in it, or at least providing political cover in it. And I'll say that is worrying for me from a Prime Minister. He could make, that single person could make a phenomenal difference to protecting Palestinian rights. Now, when I say he's complicit in it, I'm not saying he's complicit in every single act that Israel is doing, but I can say this much, that if you know that Israel is committing war crimes, and how can you not know with the ICC arrest warrants that have been issued, right? How can you not know? If you continue to provide material support to an entity that's committing war crimes, and you know that's what you're doing, and I find it phenomenal that a supply of parts for the F-35 warplanes, and you wouldn't know, or at least know there's a risk, whatever gymnastics you're doing in your fake legal analysis of it, how you couldn't know. Well, that under Article 25 of the Rome Statute is a complicit act, because you're providing the material required by a war criminal to perpetrate war crimes. That's a criminal offence. And so we are looking at Keir Starmer, we are looking at the Labour Party government, and you'll know that we have already issued a complaint to Scotland Yard for 5 British ministers from the Conservative government, which Scotland Yard are still looking at. And I'll tell you that there is nowhere for Scotland Yard to go on that other than to prosecute, because if they don't, we will be taking them to judicial review on that. There is no end point for them on that, where they can just say, no, thank you, we're not interested. So let's go to your question about the ICJ rulings. Before we talk about the plausible genocide South Africa ruling in January last year, let's just talk about the advisory opinion delivered on the 19th of July, 2024, which puts into stark contrast. I mean, look, when people talk about advisory opinions, they think it just means it's just advice. It's not just advice. It is telling you, it is advising you what the settled legal position in international law is on an issue. And the reason you call it an advisory opinion is because a state asks the ICJ, can you please tell me how I as a government need to act in accordance with international law on my future conduct? It's different to where a state party takes another state party to the ICJ and a ruling is made which is binding on those in the proceedings. And so this is a bit of a fiction that people say it's only advice, you don't have to follow it. No, you have to follow it. If you don't follow it, you're breaking international law. And in the advisory opinion on the 19th of July, 2024, ruled that Israel unlawfully occupied Gaza and the West Bank. It's simple. That occupation was illegal. It has to end. It ruled that all settlements and outposts were unlawful, including the ones that Israel itself considers are unlawful. It concluded that they needed to be dismantled. It concluded that Israel participated in acts of apartheid in relation to the Palestinians. It concluded that. That's just not a debate anymore. It's a legal fact. It concluded that Israel has an obligation for reparations with regards to the violations of Palestinian rights against the Palestinian people. And finally, most importantly, it concluded that support of this entire infrastructure that I've just outlined would be unlawful by any state, including Keir Starmer's Labour government. It would be unlawful. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing to say. So let's talk about our complicity and cooperation with Israel in light of just that. In light of just that. Then you come to the plausible genocide. Now, I just want to spend a little bit of time clarifying this. Well, not a little bit of time clarifying it, just explaining it. What the ICJ ruled was that there needed to be interim measures to control Israel's actions, because if there wasn't interim measures controlling Israel's actions, Israel was at risk of genocide against the Palestinian people. That's what plausible genocide in that context meant. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been interim measures ordered. There just wouldn't have been. There wouldn't have been a need to, because you don't kind of say, oh, well, there's no risk of genocide. but I'm going to give you some things to do anyway.
Yeah.
You know, as a lawyer, yourself being a lawyer, and whenever you apply for an interim injunction on something, it's because there's a risk of some permanent harm coming as a result of that. And so in that context, under the Genocide Convention, states not only have the responsibility to punish acts of genocide, but to prevent them, which means that the British government has a proactive legal obligation to engage in what's happening in Israel-Palestine to try to prevent what's happening in Israel, in Gaza, particularly at the moment, but also the West Bank. And that's the fact that the Labour government, led by a senior human rights lawyer whose book I read in my own training, right, to become a lawyer that I am, a person that I thought was so worthy of instructions, I instructed him in legal cases, cannot come to that conclusion on his own or with the help of a phenomenally experienced Attorney General, Richard Hammer, KC, who also is somebody that I've instructed in the past. I find that mind-blowing, worrying, and extraordinarily dangerous, because if you can't expect that from the character of our government, how can you expect it from the character of any other government?
It's truly obscene to put it in those words as well. And thank you for taking us through that and from your experience as well. It's truly just mind blowing, as you say. Okay, well, let's move on to Global 195, which is a newly launched initiative of the ICJP. I think about 3 weeks old, is it? Or maybe a little bit longer.
It feels like a year already. I tell you, there's been a phenomenal response to it. Well,
tell us a little bit about it, Tayab, and we'll move on then to maybe ask how lawyers and people listening can get involved.
Cool. So we've got this huge body of evidence that we've painstakingly collected. We understand the evidence. We know what story it tells us, what evidential story it tells us. And so we give it to police officers in the UK. We give it to the ICC. The ICC obviously collates its own evidence as well. I don't know what the totality of the evidence the ICC has collated is, but you end up with arrest warrants in the ICC. You end up with these rulings at the ICJ. So we're feeling pretty confident about our evidence. And then Scotland Yard are looking at it, and they're kind of looking at it, taking a long time to look at it, and they're not really doing much about it. And nothing's really happening. The scoping exercise hasn't moved to an investigation yet. And in the interim, tens of thousands of people have been killed, literally killed, and continue to die. And hostages are still in captivity. All of that's wrong. All of that's something that we need to prevent. And then, so we had to think about what we do. Do we just carry on sending it and asking, please, Scotland Yard, can you do something? Please, Keir Starmer, can you do something? Please, David Lammy, can you do something? And we decided, you know what, we have got a bigger responsibility than that. And we thought that what we would do is that we would engage in the sort of awakening of the global South. And, you know, we've for a long time, we've thought that, you know, the world starts and ends in the West. Yeah. And, you know, we've seen how the West has been irresponsible and betrayed the rule of law and international law and human rights principles, particularly over the last couple of years. And so we thought, well, okay, you know, let's engage with foreign governments, but evidentially engage with them. And so, but we thought, well, you know, let's have respect for legal teams in other countries as well. And so we started this project, which is the second stage of the Justice for Gaza initiative, Global 195, 195 countries in the world. Our objective is to make every law enforcement agency in every country in the world aware of the evidential story that we've collected and we continue to collect. And so what we've done is we've partnered with lawyers in different jurisdictions. We've provided them with our evidence. We've provided them with our legal arguments. We've asked them to rewrite those arguments in relation to their own jurisdictions. And some jurisdictions obviously have universal jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions are members of their own statute. Some jurisdictions have no interest in anything outside their own borders at all. But it's important to engage with those law enforcement agencies. And the primary goal is to make sure that every law enforcement agency receives a complaint like the one we submitted in the UK to Scotland Yard in relationship to the entire political establishment and military establishment of Israel, all the way from the leadership down to IDF soldiers. We want that complaint to also look at people domestically that are complicit, not just with regards to Israel. So, for example, their own government ministers, own government that have provided weapons or the ability to for Israel to carry out unlawful acts. But we want to go one step further. And the step further is to have those legal teams actually apply where possible, because it's not always possible, at least for individuals, make complaints to the police to arrest individuals. And if the police fail to do that, to go into their own local court and apply for private arrest warrants for the individual and prosecute them on a private basis all across the globe. And what if you think about the end goal of this, it will be a civil society powered movement in more countries than the ICC, which is 125, and that will be prepared to act against war criminals that are suspected of perpetrating war crimes without the engagement of their government and without the engagement of their police if necessary, but hopefully with the engagement of their police and hopefully with the engagement of their government. And I'll tell you this, right? The Global South movement is really interesting because a number of governments at governmental level, and some governments really surprised me as to who they were, engaged with this project in private to the degree that I'll tell you, one state in particular is discussing with me or has been discussing with me joining the Rome Statute as a result of our discussions, which is huge. And one state is discussing or was discussing changing their domestic law to include universal jurisdiction crimes because they couldn't currently prosecute them, but wanted to have the ability to do that. And we engaged with that state at Ministry of Justice level to discuss the potential of prosecuting their own citizens that had committed crimes abroad, but under, for example, criminal acts of murder, criminal damage, and things like this. So that's that. And one state, which is like, blew my mind, said to me, okay, this sounds like an interesting project. Please can use this lawyer that belongs to the government to make the complaint to the government. I mean, that's interest in this.
That is interesting. Yeah.
And so there was another government, which, I don't want to name the governments, obviously, I don't want to embarrass them, but one government said, look, on the face of it, we have to act as though we're an ally of Israel and an ally of the United States. We have no choice, but we're happy to engage in a discussion about what we can actually do behind the scenes to support this work. And in that particular state, they introduced me to a couple of NGOs that they wanted me to work with. And so you see, and this is the reason why I don't want to be a politician, because they have to act to the whip, if you like, but in reality, what they feel inside is something different. Yeah. And at least they're taking a step to support accountability work where they can. And, we didn't know that our application for an arrest warrant in 2009 would be successful against Tzipi Livni. And we don't know what's going to happen now with the Global 195 project. But one thing we can say for sure is that we tried everywhere and we tried everything.
Absolutely. And just from a practical point of view, if anybody's listening, how can they support this work? Do you have to be a lawyer? Can you rely on is there support provided by Global 195 to somebody who's interested in pursuing this within their own country? And like, as you said, you're not just doing, taking on case by case arrest warrants or going on. It's actually engaging with people who are high up to make small but very significant changes, and also quite significant changes that you've just discussed. But for anyone listening, how can we support you in your work?
So if you're a legal professional, the response already, just for the record, has been phenomenal. We've had to create 2 new jobs in ICJP just to deal with the response from this. So there's a number of things we want. If you're a legal professional, get in contact with us at ICJP. On my Twitter, which is at Tayab_Ali_, there is a link, an email address on there, which is easy to look it up. Let me try to say it over the air. If you use that email address, you can, and you're a legal professional, there is a mechanism that we have for you to join our work, whether you're in the UK or across the globe. And we literally want people from everywhere. There is no jurisdiction when we don't want to be part of Global 195, including Israel, by the way, including Vatican City, including Palestine, right? We have an interesting relationship with people in Israel, which is, dangerous for them because of the way that the far-right government is now behaving towards its own citizens. But we have support from inside Israel too, which is really useful. So if you're a legal professional, join us, help us with legal work, help us in your own jurisdiction. We'll train you, we'll help however we can. If you're not a legal professional, if you're a diplomatic professional with links to government, get in touch, let us know, let us talk to your governments through your contacts, through your links. That's phenomenally important. And if you're not any of those two things, then share our work, make sure you amplify it, make sure you champion it, make sure you understand it, make sure you follow it. You can fund us. There's a donation bar on our website, ICJPalestine.com. And by the way, ICJP is not a charity. We're a not-for-profit company, and that's important to state because we're not engaged in dealing with charitable funds because we do political activity clearly, right? So you can fund it, but most importantly, stay engaged. Do not think that your voice is irrelevant. If you're a school teacher, if you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, if you're working in a restaurant, if just a regular person in the street and you have neighbors, talk to people, tell them what's happening, tell them how important it is, and make sure they understand before it comes to our door. We're protecting the rule of law. That's what we're doing. And the rule of law protects us. Advocacy is phenomenally important.
Brilliant. And we'll share as much as we can about this initiative. It is so important and, encourage as many people to get involved as possible. Tayab Ali, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. That was just a truly fascinating discussion with you and I really appreciate it.
No, thank you very much. Really grateful for having me on board, particularly because our voice needs to be amplified and I know it's being suppressed. So I'm really grateful for you doing what you do, Sarah.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.